Week 16 of the fantasy football season, and now most fantasy leagues, it's a semifinal for the championship. So he's a wide receiver, starts sit every matchup. Thursday night, Denver Broncos at the Chargers division game from the AFC West. Courtland Sutton, he's a start each and every week. I know last week the numbers were down for Courtland Sutton, but he still found the end zone. He's putting up numbers weekly, and he's the number one target easily all season long in this offense. He's a must-start. Devon Vele, he was shut out. It's been an inconsistent rookie season for Vele. We've seen some flashes from him, no doubt about it, but this week, he's just not a player you could trust. Coming off a goose egg, he's a sit. Ladd McConkey, a start, came back last week, had a big game early in the game, and then second half, Tampa Bay, they just shut down this Charger offense. But McConkey, he could run all the routes, he could make the plays. Him and Herbert are locked in. He's a star. Quentin Johnson is sit. I know last week he had a touchdown, got off to a nice start, but there's a lot of games with Johnson. He'll have 2 or 3 big plays and disappear the rest of the ball game and not doing much. And now he's banged up a little bit with injuries. So with all those factors and a tough matchup versus a good defense, he's a sit. Houston Texans at the Kansas City Chiefs. Nico Collins, he's a start each and every week. Last week the yards were low, but he found the end zone twice in that victory versus the Miami Dolphins. So this week, even in a tougher matchup versus a good defense, he's a must-start. Tank Dell will see it. Just the volume, the receptions, targets, all that hasn't been there here for Tank Dell this season. CJ Stroud's definitely taken a step back. His numbers aren't what they were last season. So in a tough matchup for fantasy owners, he's an easy sit. DeAndre Hopkins, a flex option at best. Hopkins, he's definitely had some good games, but now with Patrick Mahomes, where it looks like he might not play in this game. And to be honest, there's no reason for them to really push Mahomes, where he's week to week now with the ankle injuries. Patrick Mahomes with a mild high ankle sprain. So right now, if I'm Kansas City, I would sit him, and Carson Wentz would come in at the quarterback position. So Hopkins a flex, Xavier Worthy a sit. We've seen a couple pop games here and there from Xavier Worthy. Last week he found the end zone, had a nice PPR day, over 15 fantasy points was Worthy. But like I said, if Mahomes is out of the lineup, and even when he's been in the lineup, he's been too inconsistent to trust. Pittsburgh Steelers at the Ravens, big division matchup. No doubt about it here. George Pickens, he's been out over the last few weeks, but I think he returns in this game, and he's a start. He's a big play wide receiver. Him and Russell Wilson, they've been locked in since Russ has been the quarterback over the last 2 months of the season. So if he's playing, he's a start. Calvin Austin, Mike Williams is sits. I know Calvin Austin last week had a decent ball game. I know he's a speedy wide receiver, and Russell Wilson's always like those quick wide receivers. Matchups like this, unless you're in deeper leagues, or leagues where you start 3-4 flexes or something like that, Calvin Austin's not someone I could trust week in and week out. He's a sit. Mike Williams, a sit as well. They made a deal for him, obviously, at the NFL trade deadline, and he just hasn't done much as Mike Williams. He's not 100%, in my opinion, still coming off the ACL injury, and we have to see a lot out of him to consider him even to be on most fantasy rosters. Zay Flowers' a start last week. I know it wasn't a great game for Zay Flowers in a great matchup at the New York Giants, where it went to Rashad Bateman, who had the 3 catches, 80 yards, 2 touchdowns. But Flowers, one of the better route runners in the league, one of the quickest wide receivers, and you can line him up anywhere in a formation. So this week, even in a tougher matchup versus Steelers, he's the number one target, in my opinion, in the passing game to start. Bateman is sit. Like I said, he had the 2 touchdown game, but his games are few and far in between. His Bateman in this offense, obviously, it's all around Lamar, his playmaking ability, Derrick Henry, Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews. So Bateman being the 5th option in this offense, even after coming off a nice game, he's a sit. Giants at the Falcons, Malik Neighbors, he's a start. Last week, one of his better games in months for Malik Neighbors, where he had 10 catches, 82 yards, found the end zone. This week, a good matchup at the Falcons. Their defense isn't all that good, and I know the quarterback position's been a carousel, and let's be honest, all guys, NFL starters in Daniel Jones, Drew Lock, and Tommy DeVito have been there. And Malik Neighbors, he's still putting up pretty solid numbers, in my opinion, weekly. So this week, he's a start. Wan'Dale Robinson is sit. He had a nice start to the season, was Wan'Dale Robinson, when Daniel Jones was in there in quarterback, but ever since then, he hasn't done much. He's Wan'Dale Robinson, and even in a good matchup versus Atlanta Falcon team, he's a sit for me. Now to the Falcons, Drake London, he's a start each and every week. Him and Kirk Cousins are locked in weekly. He found the end zone last week at the Vegas Raiders on Monday Night Football. And Drake London, he was a second, third rounder for a reason for fantasy owners. He could go out there, he could play make, he could make big plays, and we've seen it throughout the season. I know the numbers haven't been elite numbers, but they're always solidified numbers where he's in that 12, 20 point range weekly. Darnell Mooney, a flex option. Last week, a slam dunk matchup. It was at the Vegas Raiders, but he was held catchless as Darnell Mooney. But this week, his second try at it back home, where this Falcon offense is better at home than it's been on the road this season. I think Mooney, even coming off a bad game, could be a viable flex option. New England Patriots at the Buffalo Bills. Demario Douglas, pretty much the only receiver that's an option in this offense for this New England Patriot team. So Demario Douglas, he's that 1A, 1B option, him or Hunter Henry in the passing game. But Demario Douglas, his ceiling's pretty much been 9 and 10 fantasy points in PPR leagues. So this week, even in a matchup where they're going to be trailing early and often and chasing points, I just don't trust Demario Douglas in a semifinal game. He's a sit. Now to the Bills. Khalil Shakir, he's the number one wide receiver, number one pass option in the offense for me is Shakir. And he's had a great season, and pretty much anything in the vicinity of Shakir, he's going to catch the football. So him and Josh Allen, they've been locked in all season long. He's the number one target, and this week in a great matchup versus the Patriots, he's a must start. Amari Cooper, Keon Coleman, there sits for me in this game. Amari Cooper, besides that one big game, he hasn't done much for this Buffalo Bill team. Last week, putting up 48 points was Buffalo, and for Amari Cooper to have no fantasy points in a goose egg, that's just not a good number at all. And that's obviously not a great thing for fantasy owners with confidence in Cooper. So this week, yes, he could go out there, have a good game, but I just don't think it's worth the risk because, like I said, besides one big game, pretty much he's only getting a couple points and a couple goose eggs under his belt. Keon Coleman, he's a sit for me as well in this game. Keon Coleman returned off the wrist injury last week, and he had a nice 64-yard play on one catch on 2 targets. But besides that, he didn't do much as Coleman, and we've seen it throughout his rookie season where it's either a big play he makes or finds the end zone, but pretty much he hasn't really put a complete game together all year long besides once or twice all year. So with Coleman back, it's good to see him back in the lineup, but he's not a fantasy option this week. And someone who I would sit on the bench, Detroit Lions at the Bears, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams locked in. St. Brown, he exploded in that ball game last week where he was held down a little bit was Amon-Ra over the last few weeks, but where they had to play catch up early and often, Goff, he just had all the confidence in St. Brown, and he went for 14 for 193 and a touchdown on a whopping 18 targets. So this Bear defense, I know the secondary hasn't been horrible, but Justin Jefferson, he just came off a nice ball game versus defense. And I think St. Brown, obviously weekly's a start, and he was a first-round pick for a reason. Jameson Williams a start last week. I know late-minute touchdown that salvages fantasy day for J-Mo, but J-Mo's always a nice threat. He lines up a lot of places in the offense as well. And now with David Montgomery out, I think we could see a couple jet sweeps here and there weekly for Jameson Williams. I know Gibbs, he's going to get a decent workload, but still, I don't believe Gibbs is getting 25-plus touches in these ball games. So J-Mo, they're going to use him in different ways, and I think this week at the Bears, he's a start. DJ Moore start. Last week, a lot underneath, a lot of bubble routes. He had 8 catches, 46 yards, and he took some carries out of the backfield as well. So DJ Moore, it's been a solid season for him. And this week in a matchup where they're going to be trailing points, he's a start. Keenan Allen, a flex option. Last week, I know he had 20 fantasy points in PPR league. He got peppered with targets. He found the end zone late in that one. But Keenan Allen, it's just been one good game, one bad game, it seems like, this season with the Chicago Bear team. So even in a game where I believe they're going to be down big early, have to chase points, he's only a flex option. Cleveland Browns at the Bengals, Jerry Jeudy, he's a start each and every week. What a season it's been for Jerry Jeudy. So this week in a matchup at Cincinnati where I could see this being a high-scoring game, their defense is horrible this year, he's a must-start. Elijah Moore, Sid, I know he's had a couple pop games here and there as Elijah Moore, but we just haven't seen the consistency week in and week out. And in a big playoff matchup, I don't think Owen is going to go out there and have confidence in him. He's a sit. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, they're locked in weekly as starts for the Cincinnati Bengal team. Jamar Chase, best wide receiver in fantasy football easily this season, putting up monster numbers. Him and Burrow been locked in. T. Higgins a start. Last week found the end zone on a nice deep ball. And T. Higgins, for the majority of the season and the games he's played, he's put up points. And obviously he's going to try to cash in on a big contract where his franchise tag is up this offseason. Tennessee Titans at the Indianapolis Colts. Calvin Ridley a start. Pretty much him and Tony Pollard. I've said this week after week, the only 2 players that have viable fantasy options. So this week in a good matchup at the Colts, a defense that isn't that good, really he's a start. Westbrook Akeen, he's been a touchdown and nothing all season long. And in a big spot here, you're not going to trust Westbrook Ikhine. He's a sit. Josh Downs, a start. He came off injury last week, but I believe he's going to be the best option in this offense in the passing game for Indianapolis. And this week with a decent matchup versus the Titans, even though it wasn't a great game for Downs, only 3 catches, 36 yards, he's a start. For me, Michael Pittman is sit. Him and Anthony Richardson all season long, they haven't had the rapport. And Michael Pittman, I know he'll get numbers here and there, but his ceiling really isn't that high. Where at least Downs, he has a higher ceiling. And Pittman's been middle of the pack. At best, 7-10 fantasy points, he's a sit. Rams at the Jets, these are 2 locks. Both these teams wide receivers. Cooper Kupp, he's a start. I know last week he had a goose egg, but after a bad game, I believe Cooper Kupp's going to go out there, especially on 10 days rest, and have a monster performance. We know this Jets secondary can't stop anyone. We just saw Brian Thomas go off for a monster game, where obviously they had no one else in the receiving game. Puka Nacua, he's a start each and every week. It's either a 100-yard game or a game where he's finding the end zone. Big physical wide receiver. Him and Matthew Stafford are locked in. I know it's a cross-country trip here for this Los Angeles Ram team, but I think they're going to be fine. Like I said, 10 days off. They're leading their division right now in the NFC West, and I think Puka Nacua has another big game. Garrett Wilson a start. He finds the end zone almost weekly, it seems like, the last couple weeks here for Garrett Wilson. Him and Rodgers on the same page. In this offense, they're hitting on all cylinders for this New York Jet team. And Davante Adams, 9 catches, 198 yards, 2 touchdowns. Him and Aaron Rodgers turned the clock back last week, and this week definitely could be a high-scoring game, so he's a start. Philadelphia Eagles at the Commanders, A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, easy locks in your lineup weekly. Smith had his best game of the season last week. I know Brown, he looked like he got injured at the end of that ball game, but he was fine in the locker room, and there's nothing to report on A.J. Brown being injured, anything like that. So Brown, like I said, him and Hurts, there was some off-the-field stuff with the press a couple weeks ago, but they came out, they hit on big plays, and this offense was a well-oiled machine versus a good defense in Pittsburgh. So these wide receivers weekly, you got to trust them. I know Devonta Smith, there's been inconsistent weeks, but then there's weeks like last week, he goes out there and gets over 20 fantasy points in PPR leagues. Scary Terry McLaurin, he's a start each and every week. Number 1 target in this offense, found the end zone twice in that game in New Orleans, and this is a big division matchup with the Eagles coming to town. So Terry and Daniels locked in, he's a start. Cardinals at the Panthers, Marvin Harrison, mixed bag of result, rookie season. It's been for him, and he's definitely tough to trust week in and week out. But this week, I'll put him as a flex option. Good matchup at the Panthers. Their defense can't stop anyone. And Marvin Harrison, I know he's number 3 option this season in the offense, behind McBride, behind James Conner, and then you got Marvin Harrison. But this week, like I said, with a decent matchup, he's a flex. Adam Thielen to start. He could run all the routes. Him and Bryce Young have a good rapport, and they're going to be trailing most likely early and often. We saw Thielen last week, got off to a slow start, but still finished with a nice productive ball game. Jalen Coker to sit. I know last week he went for 110 and a touchdown, but he had a long touchdown before halftime where it was just a breakdown in the Dallas Cowboys secondary. So Coker, we have to see more out of him to put him in the starting lineup. But Xavier will get banged up with the groin injury. Coker most likely is going to get a start in this game. Minnesota Vikings at the Seattle Seahawks. Great receivers on both teams in this game. Justin Jefferson, last couple weeks, the numbers really popped off once again. Last week, he could have 2 touchdowns, but he looked to run with one of them, and he dropped it before he caught it. But he still had a big game. Him and Darnold are locked in. And this week at Seattle, I could see a high-scoring game between these teams. Jordan Addison, the last month of the season, he's really turned the season around where he was injured early on, and him and Sam Darnold didn't have a good rapport. But weekly Addison, he's getting that 12, 15-point fantasy range. So this week at Seattle, I like him as a start. DK Metcalf, numbers have definitely dropped off over the last month of the season. Jackson Smith-Njigba has been out there and putting up big points weekly for fantasy owners. But Metcalf, he's due for a big game. Believe it or not, this Viking secondary does give up the most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season, even though a lot of it is garbage time. But DK Metcalf in this ball game, we know Seattle, they know they got to go out there, and this is a must-win game. So I think Metcalf, I know he's been banged up majority of this season. That's why the numbers are down. He goes out there and has one of his better performances. Smith-Njigba, one of the best receivers in fantasy football the last month, 6 weeks of the season. Either 100-yard games or he's finding the end zone. And him and Geno, they've just been locked in. I know Geno's banged up. We don't know if he's going to play in this ball game. But either way, both these wide receivers, I think, could go out there with the gunslinging Sam Howell and have a decent game. Jacksonville Jaguars at the Raiders. Brian Thomas Jr., he's locked in as the number one target easily in this offense in the passing game, with Evan Ingram out for the season. And we saw last week, Brian Thomas went out there. He put up a monster game versus the Jets defense, 10 for 105 and 2 touchdowns. So this week, once again, a great matchup at the Raiders. I'm not saying he's going to go out there and put up a game like that, but I still believe 70, 80 yards and a touchdown is a real possibility. Jakobi Meyers is a start. Last week, off to a slow start was Myers, but he got his points at the end of that ball game when they were chasing points and trying to have a game-winning drive with this Raider team. So Myers, he can run all the routes, easily the number one option in the wide receiving room, with Bowers being the number one option in the passing game. And this week versus a bad Jacksonville defense that got torched by Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson, he's a start. 49ers at the Dolphins, Jawan Jennings, he's a start. Last week, I know it was a down game, no doubt about it, for Jawan Jennings, but this week a great matchup at the Miami Dolphins, where they can't stop anyone all season long. So I think Jennings, he bounces back after a bad performance. He's a start. Deebo Samuel will sit. It just hasn't been there this season for Deebo. I don't know if it's injuries. I don't know if he's on the heavy decline since he's getting up there in age where wide receivers start to decline, but the numbers haven't been there all season long. He's been one of the bad busts in all fantasy football, no doubt about it, is Deebo Samuel. And like I said, definitely he could go out there and have a big game, but it just hasn't happened. And how much longer a fantasy owner is going to wait? You got this far to the season and Deebo hasn't done much. At this point, I would just sit him. Tyreek Hill, a start last week. Definitely a down game here for Tyreek Hill. But we know this Dolphin team on the road, no matter if it's indoors, in 15-degree weather, wherever it is, they just can't play well on the road. But back home this week, where I believe this could be a high-scoring game, so he's a start. Jalen Waddle, another wide receiver. I know he's had a couple decent games here and there this season, but you just can't trust him week in and week out. And now he's nicked up with an injury as well as Jalen Waddle. So this week, I'm just not even going to bother with Jalen Waddle. If I'm the Waddle owner, he's a sit. Tampa Bay Bucks at the Cowboys. Mike Evans, he's been back the last few weeks. They've been putting up a lot of points, and they moved right back up into the standings. So Mike Evans coming off his best game of the year, 9 for 159 and 2 touchdowns. And this week, a slam dunk matchup with the Cowboys. Their defense can't stop anyone. Diggs, we know he's out for the season here. Mike Evans, an easy start. Jalen McMillan, a flex option. Last couple weeks, he's starting to get it going, is McMillan, and putting up fantasy points. He found the end zone once again last week. A couple weeks ago, he had 2 touchdowns. And this week, I think in deeper leagues, he's a decent flex option. Like I said, Dallas's defense can't stop anyone. And this week, I think McMillan could be decent. CeeDee Lamb a start. Last week, he got off to a monster start in the first half. And then the second half, we just didn't see much at all from CeeDee Lamb. But he's a start each and every week. This Tampa Bay secondary definitely has holes. And Cooper Rush and Lamb are locked in, where he's been easily the number one wide receiver for this Cowboy team. Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert, this sits for me. Brandon Cooks, he'll have the occasional touchdown here and there for this Dallas Cowboy team, but the consistency hasn't been there. And I think Brandon Cooks' best days are behind him, because he's at the age as well, at 30 years old, where wide receivers start to break down. And let's be honest, Cooks, he's been everywhere, it seems like, in the NFL. Traded a whole lot and a lot of miles on his body. Jalen Tolbert is sit. He's had a decent year, is Tolbert, no doubt about it. Last week, he found the end zone, a nice toe tap in the back of the end zone. But like I said, these guys have been inconsistent all season long, and a big Final Four in your fantasy matchups. You're not going to trust guys like Cooks or Jalen Tolbert. So there sits in the final game of the week, Monday night, New Orleans Saints at the Packers. Valdez-Scantling, Cedric Wilson sits. This whole offense is depleted. Alvin Kamara, he might even be out in this ball game with an abductor injury. And you just can't trust anyone. I know Valdez-Scantling, he's going back to Green Bay, where he spent a lot of his career and obviously started over there, but he's a sit. Cedric Wilson, I know he threw a touchdown last week. It was a great play, but he's a wide receiver that hasn't been fantasy relevant in years, going back to his Dallas Cowboy days. And I know someone's got to catch the football. I know someone's got to make plays, but these aren't the guys if you're trying to get to a championship. And now to the Packers, Jayden Reed to start. Last week, I like how they got him more involved. Jet sweeps, even took some carries out of the backfield, quick bubble screens. And that's what you need to do with a guy like Jayden Reed. Get him in space, get him some blocking, because he's a quick wide receiver and one of the better yard after catch wide receivers. So this week in a great matchup versus Saints, he's a start. Romeo Doubs, a flex option. Last week, one of his best games of the season. Coming off a concussion, he had 40 yards and 2 touchdowns. And this week, I think he's a flex option. This defense is all banged up. They're not stopping anyone. And we saw McLaurin last week have 2 touchdowns. So Doubs a flex option. Christian Watson a sit. he's either been a boom or bust wide receiver all season long, is Christian Watson. It's either a big game for him or a game we score no points or 3-4 fantasy points. And last week we saw him pull up and hold that ankle in one of the last plays of the game at the Seattle Seahawks. So I think Christian Watson, I would just play it safe and put him on the bench. Because like I said, yes, he could pop off and have a good game, but it's a risk, no doubt about it. So that's wide receiver starts sit every matchup for a crucial Week 16 of the fantasy football season.